Hello, class and professor. It is so nice to have a conversation with you face to face. It's Renee. I feel like I know so many of you already. The class has been such a huge blessing for me, and I have so enjoyed having conversations with you. And I just thought it would be nice to do a presentation face to face as opposed to some slides, since because I just thought it'd be fun. Anyways, I'm very excited to share with you the book that I did for our essay reading. It was a surprise even to me. I had picked something else out initially and found this book at the library. I had actually read one of her quotes in a nature essay that I had used in one of my papers. And so it was sort of serendipitous that it all came together at the last minute. The book is by Rebbecca Solnit, and it is called The Faraway-Nearby. And just to let you take a look at it there, the cover actually has feathers on it. I was just taken with how poetic that one quote was, and I figured I would look up something that she'd written. This was the only one in my library, and I was completely hooked from the moment I read the table of contents, and I will show you why. It's very much like a concrete poem. It starts up here with apricots is the first one, and then it goes to mirrors, ice, flight, breath, and then towards the center, it's wound, knot, unwound, which is unwound, basically, and then backwards out. So breath, flight, ice, mirrors, apricots, ending. So right away, I was interested, why did two essays share the same title? Why is it so secular? It made me think of a concrete poem, and I was just curious right away why it was laid out that way. And also just the diversity in topics. I mean, ice, flight, apricots. It just sounded like it could be full of lots of different sensory writing, lots of imagery, and it was. So I started in apricots and was surprised that at the bottom of the story, there is a ticker tape of another story. And I assumed that it would be kind of like White Horse, which had the subtitles, the footnotes. And I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. Like the story underneath is going to have to do with this particular essay. But actually, the story on the bottom runs the entire length of the book. And it is really its own essay. It was really a very rare treat to sort of traverse the entire body of the book before I had even finished reading it, started reading it. Right away, I wanted to read the story on the bottom. I was so curious. I was actually in the car. My husband was driving, and I read the whole thing out loud. And it only took like 20 minutes. It was such a treat. It doesn't have a title, this particular story, at the bottom, but the opening line is that moths drink the tears of sleeping birds. And I read it and thought, why? Like, what could that possibly have to do with anything? I don't know. I wasn't sure. But apparently it was the title of a short scientific study that she had read, which she thought was intriguing. And it turns out that moths actually do drink the tears of sleeping birds because they need the nutrients in the tear water more than just regular fresh water. And she takes that image. She's very much a naturalist, and she's observing the natural world, and she pulls meaning out of it. She takes that to mean that as we suffer, like suffering can be productive, if not to ourselves, then to those around us, simply because everything decays and everything grows, and that's just sort of the way our universe works. There was one particular moment in the ticker story on the bottom about the moths that detailed a particular species of moth that when it emerges, when it's born or hatched, it has no mouth. So it cannot take in food to sustain itself. Actually, whatever it has stored up in its body is all of the energy that it uses in its entire life, and then it dies. And I was horrified. I thought that was possibly the worst thing in the world, like a death sentence. And I thought, like, how horrible that creation could have things in it like that have they don't have a chance. And then, of course, I realized, because I was reacting to it so strongly, that, of course, that's exactly what it is to be human. We may have mouths and we have means of trying to perpetuate our lives, but we certainly aren't in control of them, and we certainly have no means of sustaining ourselves. At some point, everybody dies, which is bleak, but true. And she tackles these topics about birth and life and death and decay with so much elegance and so much poetry, and it really helps you to feel like a stronger, more conscious participant in the human experience by the time that you read her work. So I thought that was wonderful. I was hooked. I wanted to read more. So I started with the first essay, which is Apricots, and I promise I won't ruin the contents of the whole book. But the premise of Apricots is that her mother is passing. She's struggling from Alzheimer's, and it's a very long journey, a long road. And she's watching her mother lose her own stories. And she says it's like watching the words fall off a page, that she's sort of returning to blankness. And she really mourns that for her mother. And as they're trying to sell the mother's house, she inherits 100 pounds of apricots from her mother's fruit trees, which are all put out on the floor. She puts them in her apartment on sheets because to pile them means they would smush each other and mold. And she writes, and I'll share with you, if I can find it, about how these apricots sort of came to be very symbolic for her. She writes, it felt so much like my life, this pile of what might be abundance in other circumstances, requiring scrutiny, weeding, becoming slightly disgusting as the pile began to seep juices onto my floor and to smell a little. It felt like a living organism, a slime mold, an accompanying army of apricots, as though it might multiply, as though it might move of its own accord, and it was impossible to pick free of rot. She takes this pile of apricots to sort of have like fairy tale implications. And she writes about how fairy tales are full of people who feel that they have no power in their situation and they're unable to pursue their desire or their dream or to get out of the situation that they're in. And they're usually given a task, like to spin the straw into gold, to sift through the seeds and find the one grain, or to pick through the pile of hay and find the pearl or the needle. And she said that it felt as if these apricots were just a very fairy tale task, that if somehow she could get through the apricots, maybe she could get through the season. And she goes through this journey of trying to turn them into chutneys and jams and apricot liqueur and to can them and to give them away as gifts, anything she can do to sort of sift through this task, which is a very visual representation of something that is ripe, beautiful, but also like in a matter of days is dying and making slime on your floor. And also she talks about how fairy tales usually journey from this point of conflict. They usually take you away from home on your task. And once you've achieved it, you turn back and return to your home transformed. And her book, with those mirroring titles that worked inward and outward, is very much like that. It starts with apricots with this story, and it works out to knot in the center, the knot in her story, which has to do with a medical, sort of her own brush with death, her own medical challenges, and I don't want to spoil it, and then unravels outward from that back to apricots again. The story is also very much like a labyrinth, and she talks about that, how a friend of hers in Iceland had made a labyrinth for an art project, and she was able to walk through it and really felt like, wow, this is so interesting, because the point isn't just to journey in, it's to journey out and to return. And she reflected on how actually a part of the inner ear is called a labyrinth because it does curl. And she reflected that listening is very much like that. You receive through your ear, through these tubes, the words that are being said to you, but if you're really listening, you're also processing it internally, and some sort of response should be coming out. And again, her book, in that fashion with the table of contents, it is working its way through and out like a labyrinth. She also describes her book as a spool of thread, in that you take this sort of amorphous lump of wool and different lengths of fibers, and through craft and patience and tools, you turn it into thread that can be used for something. And she discusses how in this really difficult season of her life, writing this book in particular allowed her to do that, to make meaning out of the suffering, to drink the tears of sleeping birds. She says that her book is like a raft, that for all the people who might say that art is imitation, or that it doesn't have a place, or that maybe it doesn't function, she writes about how people reached out to her having read her book and were like, I read your book, I would love you to come to stay with us in Iceland, or to present at our library in Nevada, or and how out of her suffering, she crafted this book. Like, this was her task, and it saved her. And in that discussion, she weaves together so many stories. This is not just a book about her life and her mother or her hang-ups, although she is incredibly vulnerable and personable. You feel like you know her through the book. But she really knits together the stories of countless people. There are so many diverse topics. I've been thinking about how her name Solnit should probably be spelled soul, like heart, and knit, like knitting, because she's like a weaver. It's beautiful. And there really is something for everybody. There are absolutely intrepid survival stories that take place in the Arctic, that are chilling and horrifying to somebody like me who much prefers the temperate zone or somewhere warm. She writes about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, and how that story like is framed by a captain of a ship in the Arctic who doesn't want to turn back because of his pride, and how by hearing Frankenstein's story, is cautioned about his pride, and decides to turn back and preserve the lives of his men on board. She writes about Virginia Woolf and her suffering, and how, the death of her father, who just bent over to pick up a fig or something for his wife and had like an abscess rupture. And so she writes about all these dramatic moments that function as like a deus ex machina in these people's lives that just completely change things. All the stories are dramatic. She writes about different religions. She writes about the desert and her adventures in the Grand Canyon. She writes about this Chinese painter who I hadn't heard of, Wu Daozi, whose paintings were so incredible that people believed he could step into them, which is very much the way she feels about her book and about these other people's stories, that she can step into them. And she really is a modern day Scheherazade, in doing that, in collecting all of these ideas together. It doesn't follow, like I said, a single narrative path. It isn't just her story, it's many stories. A New York Times review that I read said that actually the author was Romm, and she says, the certainty of a path through chaos, the magic of story itself. And I agree. I think that Solnit's ability to collect all these different things and make meaning out of it isn't really a destination. It really is a journey as you read and experience her writing, particularly because of the really strong motifs with the titles. Apricots, Ice, Breathe. She mirrors those motifs throughout all of the essays, and it almost feels like a brain teaser. There's so many points of connection. It's a very interconnected collection. Each essay sort of takes you and puts you in a different perspective, and in the same period of her life. Yeah, I think the part that I took away the most strongly, that stood out the most to me, was the story of Che Guevara, who apparently rode around on a motorcycle through Argentina and Chile, and he had been studying to be a doctor and was particularly interested in caretaking lepers, people suffering from leprosy. And he writes about like observing doctors trying to counsel lepers that they need to take care of their hands and their feet because it's actually a bacterial disease. And the worst part is probably that they're isolated from people. And there are far worse, more infectious diseases than leprosy. But they lose feeling in their hands and their feet. And because they lose feeling in their hands and their feet, they stop caretaking their hands and their feet. And that's why lepers lose body parts, fingers. They can't feel that the cut they're holding is too hot, or that they've turned the key too hard on the door and cut their fingers. And it leads to infection and it gets gross. But the doctor was trying to impress upon these people, like, you have to take care of your hands. You've got to be careful. And they universally, all the people he spoke to said, but it's hard because, like, I don't feel them. Like, I don't value them. They're in the way. And the doctor said, well, you need to have empathy for your hands as if it was somebody outside of yourself, like who you could never feel for, who isn't you, but you would still care for them. And it was such a beautiful, simple illustration of empathy and how we really can't care for anything that we don't feel for. And I guess that's sort of the wound that Solnit addresses in the book, is a lack of feeling. And how we can choose to be empathetic and choose to be interconnected and choose to grow from each other's sufferings, learn from each other's stories, and eventually pull ourselves out or accept where we are. It was really, really lovely. She writes in the end, she said, pared back to its bare bones, this book is a history of emergency and the stories that kept me company then. And she goes into more length, but it is true. It is a book about emergency, various stories of emergency, and how stories are the things that saved people, which is something that I think as English majors we all really connect with and really value. So I hope that you will feel enthusiastic about the book. I certainly do. If you get a chance this summer, I really recommend it. It sort of pushes the limits of what a book can do. The story along the bottom, the concrete poetry in the beginning that looks like a flock of birds or a mountain, it's a very tactile sensory experience. The stories are beautiful, heartbreaking, joyful. And I would love to talk to any of you. If you get a chance to read it, I would love to hear what you think. And I really sincerely look forward to seeing your projects this week and seeing what you guys are reading and enjoying. So thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful semester. I wish you all the best of luck with your finals week, and congratulations to those of you who are graduating. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody.